The circumstances surrounding this incident are sufficiently grave and unusual to warrant independent scrutiny beyond our domestic institutions. I therefore, with a full sense of responsibility as the Executive Governor of Oyo State, call on the appropriate international human rights and accountability mechanisms, including those within the United Nations system, to closely examine the facts surrounding this abduction and the circumstances of its resolution. Such scrutiny is not intended to undermine our institutions. Rather, it is intended to reinforce public confidence that the truth will be established and that every person found to bear responsibility, regardless of office, influence, or affiliation, will be held accountable.
On Monday, July 14, 2026, the day after the rescued Oriire school children and teachers were formally handed back to Oyo State, Governor Seyi Makinde stood before cameras and said this: "For 7 years, we did not witness anything like this in Oyo State. I declared to run for the President of Nigeria at 4 a.m., and by 9 a.m. the following morning, the children were abducted." He then called on the United Nations and other international human rights and accountability bodies to independently investigate the circumstances of the abduction and rescue. The presidency's response came within hours. Presidential spokesman Bayo Onanuga described the probe call as unnecessary and politically motivated. He said, "The man is just playing politics, and it is the politics of the bizarre. He wants to weaponize anything available, including dredging up a strange conspiracy theory." While everyone is focused on whether Makinde's UN probe call is legitimate or political, nobody is asking the question that the presidency's maximum force reveals. If an independent international investigation would simply confirm the federal government's account of the Oriire crisis, as Onanuga implied it would, why does calling for that investigation produce the phrase bizarre politics and strange conspiracy theory rather than we welcome it? Before we go further, if you're new here, this channel exists for one reason: to give Nigerians the political analysis mainstream media won't. Hit subscribe and stay with me. This gets deeper. Governor Seyi Makinde's Monday broadcast was a carefully structured public communication that simultaneously did 5 things. First, it formally received the rescued victims and assumed state government responsibility for their welfare, rehabilitation, and continued education. Second, it named the fallen: 3 teachers, 4 named security personnel, an unnamed soldier, and an injured community member, publicly establishing a human cost record that the federal government's rescue announcement had not provided. Third, it announced specific security measures, strengthening oversight of Old Oyo National Park access routes, improving community intelligence, and establishing protocols to prevent criminal use of border communities. Fourth, it called on the United Nations and international human rights bodies to independently investigate the circumstances of the abduction and rescue. Fifth, it included the 4 a.m. timing statement, linking the abduction to the morning after his presidential declaration. The UN probe call is contained in 2 specific sentences. The circumstances surrounding this incident are sufficiently grave and unusual to warrant independent scrutiny beyond our domestic institutions. I therefore, with a full sense of responsibility as the Executive Governor of Oyo State, call on the appropriate international human rights and accountability mechanisms, including those within the United Nations system, to closely examine the facts surrounding this abduction and the circumstances of its resolution. He explicitly stated his intention was to establish whether there were institutional failures, negligence, or collusion, not to discredit Nigerian institutions. Bayo Onanuga's response to Makinde's broadcast was issued Monday and contains 4 distinct argumentative components. First, he said the federal government had no objection to a UN investigation if Makinde believed there were unresolved issues. "Our doors are open. Let the UN come if he thinks there is more to it than what our military has explained." Second, he characterized the demand as unnecessary because the military had already provided detailed explanations about the rescue operation. Third, he argued that it was unreasonable to suggest government officials or security agencies could have conspired to expose children to trauma, noting that security personnel lost their lives in the rescue effort. Fourth, he accused Makinde of political motivation. It is just unfortunate that Mr. Makinde, maybe because of politics, because he is a presidential candidate now, doesn't have any trust in our own institutions and is now calling on an external body to come and investigate. The man is just playing politics, and it is the politics of the bazaar. He wants to weaponize anything available, including dredging up a strange conspiracy theory. The specific UN mechanisms that Makinde invoked, international human rights and accountability mechanisms, including those within the United Nations system, encompass several distinct institutional bodies with different mandates and different levels of investigative authority. The most relevant are the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which can conduct fact-finding missions and publish reports on human rights situations in member states with or without the host government's cooperation. The UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders and on the right to education, who can visit countries, examine cases, and issue public findings, and the Human Rights Council's Universal Periodic Review process, through which Nigeria's human rights record is examined by member states. None of these bodies can compel Nigeria to cooperate with an investigation. None can impose sanctions or legal consequences. What they can do is produce independently authored public findings that enter the international human rights record and that are not subject to the Nigerian federal government's control of the domestic narrative. The key institutional difference between a UN mechanism and a domestic investigation is precisely what Makinde said and what the presidency's response implicitly acknowledged: independence from the institutions whose conduct is being examined. A domestic investigation, whether by the National Assembly, the ICPC, the police, or the DSS, is conducted within the same institutional framework that the investigation is examining. A UN mechanism is not. That independence is the accountability value that Makinde's call asserts is necessary, and it is that assertion rather than any specific allegation that the presidency described as bizarre politics. Makinde made a specific constitutional argument in his broadcast that Onanuga did not directly address. He reminded the federal government that responsibility for national security rests with it under the Constitution, not with state governments. That argument has a specific purpose. It preemptively frames any finding of institutional failure, negligence, or collusion as a federal government accountability finding rather than a Makinde government accountability finding. The constitutional division of security responsibility is established in the exclusive legislative list of the 1999 Constitution. Policing, the military, and national security are federal exclusive domains. A UN investigation that finds institutional failures in the Oriire crisis response would, by Nigeria's own constitutional framework, be a finding primarily about federal institutions. Makinde's 4 a.m. timing statement, linking his presidential declaration to the morning of the abduction, is not a formal allegation in any legal sense. He has not filed a petition, not named a suspect, and not stated who he believes orchestrated the abduction. He has stated a factual sequence and described it as warranting investigation. That framing is analytically precise. It places the burden of investigation, and therefore the burden of establishing or refuting the implied connection, on whoever conducts the probe. A UN investigation that is given this specific factual sequence as part of its mandate would be required to examine whether the timing is coincidental or significant. An investigation that is not given that mandate, a domestic investigation conducted under federal government direction, would not be required to examine it at all. The choice of investigative mechanism therefore directly determines whether the 4 a.m. claim is formally examined.
Makinde's UN probe call on the day the rescued children were formally received is a precisely calibrated political move that serves multiple simultaneous strategic purposes. First, it shifts the Oriire crisis narrative from a completed security operation to an ongoing accountability question, ensuring that the political conversation extends beyond the rescue announcement and into the territory of institutional examination that is most uncomfortable for the federal government. Second, it positions Makinde as the accountability champion in the 2027 opposition coalition's governance narrative, the governor who demanded truth even after the children came home, against a presidency that described accountability demands as bizarre politics. Third, the 4 a.m. timing statement introduces, without formally alleging, a conspiracy dimension that will circulate in public discourse and that a federal-controlled investigation will not be mandated to examine. Fourth, it internationalizes the Oriire crisis by invoking UN mechanisms, making any subsequent federal government attempt to bury the accountability question visible to international human rights monitors who now have Makinde's formal call on the public record. The presidency's decision to respond to Makinde's probe call with maximum rhetorical force, bizarre politics, crazy theory, playing politics, rather than with measured openness, reveals a specific political calculation that the costs of appearing to welcome international scrutiny of the Oriire crisis are higher than the costs of appearing to reject it aggressively. A more measured presidency response, "We support all accountability mechanisms and welcome the governor's desire for transparency," would have been politically safer in terms of international optics, but would have implicitly legitimized the premise that the Oriire crisis warrants scrutiny beyond the military's explanation. The aggressive response trades international optics for domestic narrative control. It frames Makinde as politically motivated and frames the demand for accountability as an attack on the security institutions whose personnel gave their lives in the rescue operation. That framing is strategically effective for a domestic audience that is emotionally invested in the rescue's success. It is less effective for an international audience that reads, "We describe UN probe calls as bizarre as a sovereignty overreach." The NDC, APGA, SDP, and YPP's public backing of Makinde's UN probe call is the fastest political coalition building that any Oriire-related development has produced. Four parties that were not involved in the rescue have no operational relationship with the UN mechanisms Makinde invoked and have varying levels of political infrastructure aligned on a single position within hours of Makinde's broadcast. That speed of alignment tells you that the opposition political class, across party lines, read Makinde's move as a 2027 opposition governance narrative asset and immediately associated themselves with it. The presidency's bizarre politics response makes that alignment more valuable, not less. Each party that backed the probe call can now point to the presidency's language as evidence that the federal government is more interested in managing the political narrative than in providing the transparency Makinde described as what Nigerians deserve. Now, if what I just told you surprises you, drop a comment below. I want to know what you think before we get to the part that changes everything.
We asked whether Makinde had made the 4 a.m. timing claim during the 56-day crisis or only after the rescue. The Gazette Nigeria report indicates that the 4 a.m. statement was made on Monday, July 13, the day the rescued victims were formally received, rather than during the crisis itself. That timing is analytically significant. During the crisis, Makinde needed the federal government's full security cooperation for the rescue operation to succeed. Making a conspiracy-adjacent public statement during active security operations would have been operationally reckless and politically self-defeating. It would have framed every security agency interaction as politically compromised and would have given the presidency grounds to reduce cooperation. After the rescue, with the children safe, the political credit dispute already underway, and the 2027 campaign season formally opened, the political cost-benefit calculation for the 4 a.m. statement reversed entirely. Makinde could make the claim after the rescue without risking the rescue. The timing of the statement is not evidence of its truth or falsehood. It is evidence of a politically experienced governor who understands when specific claims are operationally safe to make. Makinde's call for a probe, whether or not it produces a formal UN investigation, has formally placed on the public record a list of questions about the Oriire crisis that the federal government has not provided public answers to. These include why prior intelligence of the threat to schools in Oriire did not produce a security presence that prevented the May 15 attack, why the federal high-level delegation did not reach the affected communities until May 31, 16 days after the abduction and 14 days after Oyo Abduction was killed, what the specific circumstances of the rescue operation on July 10 were, including what changed the kidnappers' position, and whether any of the federal security agencies that were tasked with protecting the schools and communities in Oriire had specific knowledge of the threat that was not acted on. These questions exist independently of Makinde's political motivations for asking them. They are accountability questions that a government confident in its conduct should be able to answer transparently. One of the most constitutionally significant elements of Makinde's broadcast is his explicit invocation of the constitutional division of security responsibility. He reminded the federal government that national security is a federal constitutional responsibility in the context of a probe whose findings would examine federal security institution conduct. That invocation is not accidental. In the aftermath of a crisis that produced deaths in both the federal military and the state's Amotekun Corps, the question of which level of government bears primary accountability for the institutional failures that allowed the attack and the 56-day captivity is a question with direct electoral implications. A finding that the federal security apparatus failed to act on available intelligence is a finding that helps Makinde's 2027 opposition campaign. A finding that Oyo State's community security infrastructure was inadequately maintained is a finding that helps the APC's campaign against Makinde. The UN probe call is, from one angle, a mechanism for ensuring that the accountability finding, when it comes, is produced by an institution that neither the federal government nor Makinde can control.
For Yoruba diaspora communities in the United Kingdom and the United States, many of whom followed the 56-day Oriire crisis with deep personal concern and who have investments, family connections, and cultural relationships with Oyo State, The Makinde Presidency exchange on the UN probe call is a governance credibility signal that extends beyond its immediate political dimensions. The diaspora's assessment of whether it is safe to invest in Oyo State schools, communities, and agricultural infrastructure depends partly on whether the political class that governs Nigeria is willing to subject significant security failures to transparent, independent examination. A government that describes calls for independent accountability as bizarre politics is a government whose governance quality cannot be assessed through its own self-reporting alone. The Yoruba diaspora's interest is not in Makinde winning the argument with the presidency. It is in the Oriire crisis producing an institutional examination by whichever credible mechanism that establishes the facts, identifies the failures, and generates the reforms that make the next 56-day crisis impossible. Nigeria is a signatory to the Safe Schools Declaration, a political commitment to protect educational institutions from attack and to take concrete measures to deter armed attacks on schools. Makinde's invocation of UN human rights mechanisms is analytically connected to this international commitment. By framing the Oriire crisis as warranting international accountability scrutiny, he is implicitly placing Nigeria's response to the crisis within the framework of its international commitments on school safety. The UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the relevant special rapporteurs, particularly the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Education, have mandates that encompass exactly the kind of accountability examination Makinde is calling for. Whether those mechanisms respond to his call depends on factors outside both his and the presidency's control. But his call has formally entered the international record, and any subsequent failure by Nigerian authorities to conduct a transparent domestic investigation will be noted against that record by the same international monitoring bodies that track Safe Schools Declaration compliance. The most analytically credible version of the presidency's argument begins with a genuine institutional concern about sovereignty and institutional confidence. Nigeria's security institutions, the Nigerian Army, the DSS, the police, Amotekun, successfully rescued 44 captives after 56 days at the cost of personnel lives, including Army Lieutenant F.A. Isaac and other security workers. Calling for a UN investigation of those institutions in the immediate aftermath of a successful rescue that they accomplished can reasonably be read as discounting their institutional legitimacy and as implying to international audiences that Nigerian security agencies cannot be trusted to provide accurate accounts of their own operations. That implication, if it takes hold in international security partnership discussions, could damage Nigeria's credibility as a counter-terrorism partner at the precise moment when the ISWAF foreign facilitator disclosure and the Ansaru-Oriire connection have given Nigeria legitimate grounds to seek enhanced international counter-terrorism cooperation. Onanuga's "our military has explained" position has a substantive basis. The Army has provided a detailed account of the intelligence-led rescue operation. That account deserves to be assessed on its merits before a UN mechanism is invoked to supplement it.
Misconceptions in public discourse. The first misconception is that Makinde's UN probe call is either entirely principled or entirely political. Both characterizations are insufficient. The call is principled in its institutional logic. Independent international scrutiny of significant security failures is a legitimate governance accountability mechanism that democracies deploy. It is also political in its timing, its framing, and its specific invocation of the 4 a.m. timing claim. Those two things can be simultaneously true. Accountability demands from politically motivated actors are not therefore illegitimate. The accountability question exists independently of the political motivation of the person raising it. The second misconception is that the presidency's "our doors are open" position commits the federal government to cooperating with any UN mechanism that responds to Makinde's call. International UN human rights mechanisms do not require host government permission to issue findings. They do require cooperation for in-country visits and evidence access, but they can produce reports based on documentary evidence, survivor testimonies, and public records without the Nigerian government's active participation. "Our doors are open" is a rhetorical formulation that implies openness without constituting a formal cooperative commitment. The third misconception is that a UN investigation would necessarily damage Nigeria's international reputation. The most significant reputational damage from the Oriire crisis is the established fact, documented in multiple international outlets, that an Ansaru-linked group successfully kidnapped 39 children and held them for 56 days in a southwest Nigerian national park, killing 2 teachers in the process. That fact is already in the international record. A UN investigation that establishes the full circumstances and produces reform recommendations would, if it confirms the government's account, strengthen Nigeria's international standing rather than weaken it.
For southwest Nigeria, the Makinde presidency dispute over the UN probe call has a specific strategic significance that goes beyond the 2027 electoral competition between a PDP governor and an APC presidency. The Southwest's governance tradition has historically been associated with institutional transparency, accountability, and the rule of law, values that the region's political leadership has invoked as differentiating characteristics in national governance debates. Makinde's call for independent international scrutiny of the Oriire crisis is consistent with that tradition. It asserts that transparent accountability serves governance improvement rather than threatening institutional confidence. The presidency's bizarre politics response implicitly positions institutional loyalty above institutional accountability, a posture that is inconsistent with the governance values the Southwest's tradition claims to represent. The Southwest's strategic interest is in the accountability position, not the political position, and not the federal government protection position. The region that educated Michael Oyo Abduction, the mathematics teacher who never came home, owes it to his memory to support whatever accountability mechanism is most likely to ensure that the institutional failures that made his death possible are identified, examined, and reformed.
The long-term political impact of Monday's exchange operates at three levels. For Makinde's 2027 presidential positioning, the UN probe call and the presidency's bizarre politics response have produced the most clearly drawn governance contrast between his accountability posture and the Tinubu administration's institutional protection posture since the Oriire crisis began. Every subsequent statement Onanuga makes about Makinde's political motivations reinforces the framing Makinde has established, that the federal government's response to accountability demands is to attack the person demanding accountability rather than to provide it. That framing is worth more in a 2027 campaign season than any individual policy announcement. For Nigeria's federal-state relations, the exchange has surfaced a specific constitutional tension that will define governance accountability disputes in the 2027 cycle. When a state governor calls for scrutiny of a security failure whose constitutional responsibility lies with the federal government, and the federal government responds by attacking the governor's political motivations, the accountability question is not resolved, it is deferred to the electoral arena. That deferral means Nigerians will evaluate the Oriire crisis's institutional lessons not through an independent accountability process, but through two competing political narratives whose factual bases are contested. That is a democratic accountability deficit, regardless of which narrative is more accurate. For the families of Michael Oyo Abduction, Joel Adesian, Deacon John Olaleye, Lieutenant F.A. Isaac, and the other security workers named by Makinde and absent from the presidency's communications, the political dispute between the governor and the presidency is the backdrop against which they are waiting for justice, for prosecution, for an account of what happened, for the institutional changes that might mean their loved ones' deaths produce something more than political talking points on both sides. Their weight is the accountability standard against both Makinde's probe call and the presidency's bizarre politics response will ultimately be measured. We opened with two positions issued on the same day, a governor calling for UN scrutiny of a security crisis that killed at least 8 people, and a presidency calling that call bizarre politics and a crazy theory. Both positions were delivered the day after 44 schoolchildren and teachers were formally received back by the state that lost them for 56 days. The analytical conclusion is not that Makinde is right or that the presidency is right. It is that the exchange itself, its intensity, its specific language, the presidency's willingness to use maximum rhetorical force against accountability demands, tells you something important about what both sides believe is at stake if the full facts of the Oriire crisis are examined by an institution neither of them controls. If those facts fully indicated the federal government's conduct, the presidency would welcome the probe. If those facts were irrelevant to the 2027 electoral competition, Makinde would not have made the call on the day the children came home. Both sides are right that the other has political motivations. Neither side has publicly addressed the accountability questions that exist regardless of who is asking them. The families of the fallen are still waiting for that. Drop your analysis in the comments. Do you believe Makinde's call for a UN probe is primarily about accountability or primarily about his 2027 presidential campaign? And regardless of his motivation, does Nigeria need an independent examination of what happened in Oriire between May 15 and July 10? If this analysis gave you clarity, share it with one person who needs to understand what's really happening. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.